Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker in a slightly different location to usual. You'll recognise this is not the Novara Media Studios. We are, in fact, borrowing the studio of the Communication Workers Union for today. So a big thank you to them. Lots of big stories for you tonight. We're talking about the Chagos Islands, about Lebanon, and slightly less significantly, about Laura Kuenssberg and Boris Johnson. Let's go straight into that first story. Joe Biden has said discussions are taking place over whether to strike Iranian oil facilities, though he didn't offer much clarity. This is the clip.
Would you support Israel striking Iran's oil facilities, sir?
We're in discussion of that. I think
No.
that would be a little... Anyway.
Maybe we'll strike the oil facilities. I don't know. Maybe we're talking about it. We're discussing it anyway. It didn't seem particularly thought through. It wasn't particularly clear, but it has been enough to increase global oil prices. Faisal Islam is the BBC's economics editor. He tweeted this. New crude oil price jumps 5% to $77 a barrel after President Biden asked if he would support Israel striking Iran's oil facilities. Response, we're discussing that. He doesn't say ... anyway. Meanwhile, in a sign of how Israel's war against Hezbollah is spinning out of control, the Lebanese army has today confirmed it has returned fire at Israeli troops for the first time. Their official account tweeted this earlier. Oh, that's not with the translation, is it? Let me find it with the translation. A soldier was martyred as a result of the Israeli enemy targeting an army centre in the Bint Jebel area south, and the centre's personnel responded to the sources of fire. Apologies if you can't read Arabic. In interviews with Western media, Lebanese government officials have expressed despair that their country is getting dragged into a war. And speaking to CNN, Lebanon's foreign minister claimed that Hezbollah had agreed to a ceasefire right before Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah.
You saying Hassan Nasrallah had agreed to a ceasefire just moments before he was assassinated?
He agreed, yes. We agreed completely. Lebanon agreed to ceasefire, but consulting with the Hezbollah, the speaker, Mr. Berry, consulted with Hezbollah, and we informed the Americans and the French that what happened. And they told us that Mr. Netanyahu also agreed on the statement that was issued by both presidents.
So that's really interesting there, right? And it accords with what we've been hearing from other sort of political leaders and sources over the past few days, which is there was a ceasefire deal for 21 days ready to be signed. Netanyahu had told his allies that they were going to sign it. Hezbollah had told their allies that they were going to sign it. And then what happened to explode the whole process? Israel decided they wanted to kill Hezbollah's leader. And that's why we're currently in this cycle of escalation, which looks like it's going to break out into regional war. Meanwhile, the human cost of this war is becoming ever more clear. Sky News broadcast this report from southern Lebanon.
Mohammed lived with 32 of his family here in 5 different flats until the Israeli jets came.
Rocket, he's coming, rocket. He's going 1, 2, a bit after he's going.
All of the family's 5 flats were destroyed. There's just rubble left. Children's toys amongst them. The babies' pictures are still on the wall. Their parents' wedding is pride of place. But Anwar, their mother, was showered in shrapnel and died instantly. Mohammed tells us he thinks the target was the house behind theirs. His neighbour was a Hezbollah supporter, but he and his entire family of 8 were killed.
It's kind of like collective punishment. They claim they target specific people, but they're killing everyone.
The impact hit all the surrounding homes, about 15 of them, all now abandoned.
So far, Israel's invasion of Lebanon has taken more than 1,200 lives. They include healthcare workers killed in a strike on a medical centre in Beirut. The BBC reported from that bomb site today.
They are still trying to lift the rubble from the area, and people have left this building. They don't know where they are going to go. A lot of the centers meant to shelter the displaced are overcrowded. People are staying out in the streets in Beirut because they have nowhere to go. I've been asking them about this medical center that have been targeted by an Israeli airstrike in particular, and they said that it has been serving everybody in the area, and most of those who have been killed or injured are medics. And the civil defense here say that the airstrike has targeted this medical center specifically. It's believed to be affiliated or backed by Hezbollah. But for the time being, it's a scene of rage here, and the people here are just waiting for the unknown.
Israel gave no warning that it was going to strike that clinic, and it's clear Beirut is being terrorized, according to the World Health Organization. Israel has killed at least 28 healthcare workers in Lebanon in the past 24 hours, and Lebanon's health minister says more than 40 rescuers and firefighters have been killed by Israel in just 3 days. The IDF have confirmed that 8 Israeli soldiers have been killed since they began their invasion. But as world attention turns to Lebanon, there is no let-up for the people of Gaza. Channel 4 News have broadcast this report about a single night in the Strip this week.
It's just past 1:30 a.m. Paramedics are on the move again through Gaza City. Another emergency, another Israeli strike, this time at an orphanage where dozens of displaced families had been sheltering. Wait, they tell the rescuers. Don't leave yet. There are more injured. 6 people were killed. Survivors say there was no warning, no siren, no protection.
We started getting all the bodies out. There were a lot of them. None are targets. All of them are children, women and children.
Nearby, Muscat School had also become home to those with nowhere left to go. 25 of them were killed here just before 2 a.m. Mohammed Abu Leal was trapped by the blasts. He tells us there were 2 strikes, then the classrooms caved in.
We couldn't get out because of the dust. We couldn't breathe, and so we just closed our eyes until the ambulances arrived.
Israel has hit 3 schools in Gaza in the past 2 days alone, killing at least 21 people. More than 140 schools have been attacked by Israel since the 7th of October. And that's according to UNRWA Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini, who said, quote, schools used to be a safe haven for learning. They have now turned into hell for far too many. It appears that Israeli strikes against Palestinians in Gaza have been ramped up in the aftermath of Iran's rocket barrage on Tuesday. In terms of what Iran achieved with that missile attack, I found this analysis from Sky useful.
The other issue, I think, which is really interesting from the region is we talked about Patriot missile systems. In that barrage, Israel would have used a whole load of them. There's not many left. America will look to resupply. Where else in the world are these missiles vital? They're vital in Ukraine. Ukraine desperately needs supplies. Limited supplies. Now America's got to decide, do I give them to Israel or I give them to Ukraine? It's pretty obvious where the answer to that is, and that makes it going to be very difficult for Ukraine in the coming weeks and months.
So I have to admit, yesterday I was somewhat sort of puzzled by what Iran would have achieved with those attacks, because I thought they seem to have used about 1/5 of their ballistic missile stockpile, and they haven't sort of damaged that much. I mean, it seems as if they've damaged some airfields, but it didn't seem exactly as if, that would be enough to establish deterrence and you've used a lot of your missiles. But I had forgotten that obviously it takes a lot of resources to shoot those missiles out of the sky. So when every missile that's intercepted, that's not just Iran using up one of their missiles, it's also Israel using up one of their interceptors. And actually interceptors are a much more expensive high-tech device than a missile, which makes sense. You've got to basically shoot a bullet out of the sky with another bullet, right? So if you are causing Israel to use those, that's clearly going to deplete their resources. And as the commentator there was saying on Sky, that causes pressure for the United States and for, in this case, Ukraine. To discuss the latest developments in the Middle East, I'm joined now by Nathaniel George, lecturer in politics of the Middle East at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's start with events in Lebanon. So how significant is it that the Lebanese army say they have now exchanged fire with the IDF? So that's the official army as opposed to Hezbollah.
Thank you very much for having me, Michael. As for your question, it's not unprecedented exactly. It's very rare in Lebanese history that the Lebanese army has fired back at the Israelis, but it's not completely unprecedented. But it probably won't change much on the ground. In fact, most of the Lebanese army has been redeployed out of the south in the last few days in order precisely to avoid such confrontations. But there have been there have been occasional clashes between the Lebanese army and the Israelis, notably in 1972 after the Munich massacre, Munich attack, and then Israel invaded Lebanon briefly in 1972, and the Lebanese army engaged it. That didn't do much to restore the myth or the legitimacy in the eyes of the people of the army versus Israel, and it's unlikely to do so again this time.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. You mentioned legitimacy there because obviously for Lebanese people this feels like an invasion. I mean, it is an invasion by Israel, and defending Lebanon is Hezbollah, not the army. I suppose actually there's two ways of looking at it. So I'll pose this as an open question. The people of Lebanon could say Hezbollah brought this on us. It's because Hezbollah have been firing these rockets that Israel is now invading, or they could be thinking, it's only Hezbollah who are capable of defending us. The Lebanese army, yeah, they exchanged fire on one or two occasions, but it's Hezbollah who's defending Lebanon. Which of those two sort of narratives do you think predominates?
Right now, I think unquestionably the narrative that Hezbollah is more towards the defending Lebanon is predominating amongst Lebanese society. Not that the other perspective does not exist, but what's different about this engagement right now is that Lebanese people have been watching for a year Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza. They've seen Hezbollah's restraint in terms of trying to stay out of a war, to resist it, impose a cost on Israel without starting a war. Nobody wants a war, including Hezbollah top leadership. We saw that. This policy be very clearly stated and in quite clearly executed in practice. So, of course, nobody is wanting a war right now, but the more and more Israel attacks with these more brazen attacks where they're leveling city blocks to kill one man, killing hundreds of people. They launched their air raids last week were one of the biggest air campaigns in 21st century history. It even exceeds the air campaign by more than 2 times of the opening days of Gaza. And they killed about 1,200 people in a week and about 2,000 people within the whole course of a year. So the very vicious nature and aggressive nature of Israeli policy itself is also inevitably generating resistance and support for resistance. Although there are, of course, smaller political trends and anything can happen between now and then that oppose this.
And I mean, you talked there about 100 people being killed to get one man. I'm assuming you mean the killing of Nasrallah or Nasrallah. And as far as I understand, it does. Do we know how many people were killed in that attack? Because sort of initial reports were suggesting it was very high. It looked like it would be very high because of those 4 residential buildings. But then it did seem as if sort of reports were saying deaths are in the sort of low tens.
One of the main problems with that assassination attack was that the sheer weight of the explosives that were used. They dropped, over 80 one-ton bombs to level those buildings in southern Beirut. So literally, the bodies have been pulverized into dust. I don't know what the latest figures are on the attack, but this is a massive attack that leveled city blocks.
And let's talk about what Israel are targeting in Lebanon. So obviously with Nasrallah, he's the leader of Hezbollah. People can understand what was going on there. We hear lots of phrases in the news that are somewhat confusing. So the one I was hearing this morning throughout the news was that a Hezbollah-affiliated medical center had been killed. And we showed a clip earlier suggesting 7 medics were killed. It's almost confusing what that means to a sort of British audience, because Hezbollah, we're told, is this terrorist organization. How can you have a terrorist-affiliated medical center? What does it mean to talk about a Hezbollah-affiliated medical center?
Well, Hezbollah is really a large armed political movement. It is an elected political party in the Lebanese parliament. It has a very high popularity in the areas that elects it. Over 80% of the votes that bring these seats for Hezbollah and its alliance go towards voting for Hezbollah and its allies, which in the south and the Bekaa. It operates a wide range of social welfare programs. This is also not exclusive whatsoever to Hezbollah. This is a general feature of the Lebanese state and the sectarian regime and the political economy of Lebanon, which has, since its founding, been built on a very savage form of laissez-faire capitalism, which doesn't see, which has not developed any or to a very limited extent social welfare provision directly from the state. So in all areas of Lebanon, the mainly sectarian major parties that of different sects within society are the ones that are providing services, often even with public money, and for many of them, to great profit.
I wanted to talk to you about sort of how Lebanese society will cope with something like this invasion, because I know there's quite a delicate balance in the country between different sectarian groups, different religion, different ethnic groups, and then also political factions. How does sort of the delicate power balance that exists in Lebanon confront something like this? And is there a possibility of sort of complete state collapse?
Well, for many, there's not much state left to collapse anyway, and that has been experienced multiple times throughout Lebanese history. Of course, the scale of the economic crisis that was unleashed in late 2019, 2020 is bigger than ever before. A majority of Lebanese are living under the poverty line. The state inflation has caused this collapse of the banking system, and the currency really has caused the Lebanese lira to drop and lose almost nearly over 95% of its value. No doubt people are stretched thin. However, there's a very resilient network. I mean, people have lived in this state or in a similar state of affairs for decades and have learned how to cope on a daily basis with the absence of electricity, the absence of publicly supplied water. There's lots of patchwork solutions going on. But we also have seen over the last week the displacement of over 1 million Lebanese citizens and non-Lebanese citizens that live in Lebanese territory, because there's a huge proportion of refugees, the highest proportion in the world of refugees to citizens is in Lebanon. And we're talking, of course, about Syrians and Palestinians in that regard. But in general, there is the social knowledge of how to live in sort of a collapsed state, as difficult as it is.
And we began the show with, a somewhat confusing answer, I have to say, from Joe Biden, saying that America is discussing with Israel the possibility that Israel will hit Iranian oil facilities. I suppose, how much would regional escalation mean for the people of Lebanon? Or is sort of, when it comes to Lebanon, the escalation has already begun and it's almost by the by what happens between Israel and Iran? Sort of how are people in Lebanon thinking about that aspect of this conflict?
Well, it's certainly a open question. However, if we look at the events of the last 2 weeks or so, we can begin to see, I guess, where things might develop. And if you start from the pager attack, which was a massive attack, injuring over 40, something around 4,000 people, killing 37 or so. The next day, there was a wave of the attacks on the walkie-talkies that Hezbollah used, and the massive air campaign that was waged after that. The assassination of much of the top leadership of the elite forces on the ground, elite forces of Hezbollah, and then leading towards the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. This was a very, very dramatic series of events that really was quite demoralizing for many people, and which seemed to expose the weaknesses that this formidable organization had, and really drew into question what it was going to be able to do to resist the invasion that Israel had already announced by that time. But what happened already on Tuesday is that we saw the massive Iranian missile barrage, which, if you look at Arab social media, was and the way that it was covered and people's reaction is that it came out of the blue and it was covered and received as a positive development, as a sign of the resolute nature of Iranian backing for Hezbollah's line in resisting Israel. Now, and then on top of that, you have the beginning of the ground invasion in Lebanon, which Israelis announced on Monday. And strangely enough, they didn't actually attempt anything until after the Iranian attack, which was significant in itself. We can read it now in hindsight as a sort of a test of intention and mettle, on to see what Iran would and its allies would be ready to do if they had announced their invasion. So after the Iranian attack, Israel has, for the last 2 days now, been conducting multiple raids with elite special forces into Lebanon, all of which have been repelled decisively to this point by Hezbollah forces on the ground, which have shown without a shadow of a doubt that Hezbollah remains in force, that its command and control structure is operating smoothly, that all the degradation of the airstrikes of last year haven't degraded its ability to defend Lebanese territory very fiercely. And in fact, they're attacking, if you follow the news in Arabic or the releases of Hezbollah, the fight hasn't even begun hardly in Lebanon, because they're firing across the border. They're bringing, the fight is still in the occupied territories of Palestine in many cases. So we've seen a huge turn of events in the last week, from the advantage of the Israelis to the advantage of the resistance axis. Now, clearly, and this is absolutely clear with the questions you asked, Israel will retaliate. We can expect it to be a much bigger retaliation than it was to the Iranian barrage in April. And this does have the backing of the United States. Now, the United States has put out in press releases that they do not support a potential Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear sites. Well, the Israelis have been breaking every U.S. red line in the last year in Gaza and in Lebanon. So there's no reason to believe, we have no reason to believe that Israel is not going to break red lines in Iran. But what we can see from the events of the last week, basically, is that there will be a response from Hezbollah, the resistance axis, to increased Israeli escalation. So unfortunately, we're probably going to see a very long war, a test of endurance and strength, in which the United States and its allies, the UK and the West, are likely to be very unwilling to restrain their Israeli ally until they feel more pressure to.
Nathaniel George, thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. Very insightful. We really do appreciate your time. The Chagos Islands are Britain's last African colony, and today the UK has finally agreed to give them back. The Chagos Islands will be returned to the East African nation of Mauritius, which gained independence from Britain in 1968. But back then, there was a caveat.
So basically, in 1968, back when Mauritius won its independence, it didn't get full independence because Britain kept back the Chagos archipelago from Mauritius. It had already promised in a secret deal to give the Diego Garcia atoll to the Americans for a military base. And since then, in the background, the Mauritians have been campaigning to get those islands back, to have full sovereignty, full independence, if you like. And the UN has already taken that very seriously. In recent years, though, as Britain has, for instance, embarked on Brexit, it's begun to lose international support. The African continent as a whole has really come together as well to campaign on this issue of anti-colonialism, to say Britain must end its last occupation of this last piece of its old empire in Africa. And that has, I think, galvanized a lot of international support.
So, back then, Britain held back the archipelago and forcibly expelled its 2,000 inhabitants in a move condemned by the Mauritian government as a crime against humanity. The people of the Chagos Islands will now have the right to return to all islands in the archipelago, apart from Diego Garcia, which will remain a British and American military base. The decision followed 13 rounds of negotiations between the UK and Mauritius, and that followed recent determinations at the International Court of Justice, the UN General Assembly, and the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, which recognised Mauritian arguments for sovereignty over the islands. At the ICJ, Britain was found to have unlawfully severed the Chagos Islands from Mauritius before granting Mauritius independence. The court issued an advisory opinion that the UK should give up control of those islands in 2019. The original inhabitants of the Chagos Islands were enslaved people brought by the French in the 1700s to work on coconut plantations. They came mainly from what are now Madagascar and Mozambique. When Mauritius and the Chagos archipelago passed to British control in 1814, British plantation owners continued to practice slavery there until it was outlawed, after which they brought labourers from South Asia. The forcible displacement and exile of the Chagosian people has caused untold pain and misery. Here's Olivier Bancu, chair of the Chagos Refugees Group, speaking in 2022.
My own story. So I was born on Peros Banos. I've been living there up to 1968, where my sister had to travel to Mauritius with all the family to have treatment. And I've never been able to return back. I've never have a media coverage who can send all my message to see how my island was before the installation of US military base. If we were white people with blue eyes, maybe we will have better treatment. We are not asking more. We are not asking less. We are asking our right as human beings.
The move to return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius has, however, been strongly condemned by a veritable smorgasbord of right-wing politicians, including 3 of the 4 Conservative leadership candidates. James Cleverly called the agreement, quote, weak, 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 while Robert Jenrick branded it a dangerous capitulation that will hand our territory to an ally of Beijing. Tom Tugendhat even took aim at his own party in a post on X. So he said, this is a shameful retreat, undermining our security and leaving our allies exposed. He said the Foreign Office has negotiated against Britain's interest, and it was disgraceful that these negotiations started under our watch. So when the Tories were in power, Lord Cameron rightly blocked them, only to see it back under David Lammy's complete failure of leadership. Nigel Farage, for his part, was especially concerned about how the agreement would affect the United States. He said this, giving up the Chagos Islands is a strategic disaster. Our American allies will be furious and Beijing delighted. Labour are making the world a more dangerous place. So, is President Joe Biden furious about Britain agreeing to give up these islands in the Indian Ocean? Well, here's what Joe Biden had to say. I applaud the historic agreement and conclusion of the negotiations between the Republic of Mauritius and the United Kingdom on the status of the Chagos Archipelago. It is a clear demonstration that through diplomacy and partnership, countries can overcome long-standing historical challenges to reach peaceful and mutually beneficial outcomes. This agreement affirms Mauritian sovereignty over the Chagos Archipelago while granting the United Kingdom the authority to exercise the sovereign rights of Mauritius with respect to Diego Garcia. The crucial context here, of course, is that the United States get to keep their military base. So they're happy. I think it's guaranteed for a century. Elements of the move, though, and this is significant, have been critiqued by the Chagosian community, who were not consulted by the UK government before the agreement was announced. So Chagosian Voices is a grassroots community organisation for Chagosians based in the UK and other countries. They released this statement. Chagosian Voices deplore the exclusion of the Chagosian community from the negotiations, which have produced this statement of intent concerning the sovereignty of our homeland. Chagosians have learned this outcome from the media and remain powerless and voiceless in determining our own future and the future of our homeland. The views of Chagosians, the indigenous inhabitants of the island, have been consistently and deliberately ignored, and we demand full inclusion in the drafting of the treaty. It's fair to say the plight of Chagosians has not been high on the list of priorities for many British politicians over the decades, but someone who has long campaigned for Chagosian independence is Jeremy Corbyn. This is footage from 2007. You can see him here at a demonstration. It looks like it's on Downing Street, I think. You can see people protesting against the UK being there.
Of the use of Diego Garcia for military purposes, for extraordinary rendition flights, and for nuclear-powered submarines to go in and out of it is, I think, at the heart of the whole thing.
I'm joined now by Helena, aka No Justice MTG, who you had a little bit of a preview of during my previous interview. Helena, thank you for joining me this evening. Lots of people in the comments were saying it's lucky you weren't doing anything embarrassing. Talking about embarrassing, I suppose, Britain in the International Court of Justice were found to be in breach of international law by hanging on to the Chagos Islands. The United States want us to give it back. The whole world seems to want us to give this back. But you've got all of these Tory politicians and quite a lot of right-wing pundits sort of throwing up in arms, mixing my metaphors, up in arms, about this decision to hand the Chagos Islands back. I mean, they would have said exactly the same thing about any decolonization process over the past 80 years. It's sort of, you feel like, you know, colonialism is now this thing in the past where people are supposed to say, oh yeah, I would have been against it at the time. But literally now we've got this colonial possession which we're giving back, and they're opposing it, just as I suppose they would have opposed when anything else was decolonized, leaving India, for example.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were always going to have this kind of reaction regardless. But so you keep hearing them in response go, what's next? Getting rid of Montserrat or of Gibraltar? Well, if there was an ICJ ruling saying that they advise us that we should, then I would say yes. Like the whole point is that it was found. The international community found it to be which should be the territory of Mauritius. So we gave it back. It's not more complex than it would be. So that's different to a bunch of these other things. Well, obviously, I think that we should be focusing on decolonization, but in terms of how the British state is going to act, if there's an ICJ ruling, then we should absolutely stick to it. It's very interesting. Robert Jenrick was very strong in his criticism of this move. And I'm just like, well, yeah, of course, the guy who was like fervently anti-Israel, massively opposed, you know, allowing the ICJ to be the arbiter of whether something is correct or not. Because, of course, that's why a lot of these people really love Israel, because it allows them to go, well, if things are in the interest of the West, well, we can ignore what the ICJ says, regardless of whether the opponent is Islamism, whatever that means, or whether it's China. They keep saying, there's this line that was mentioned there, this idea that we're giving up a strategic part to Beijing, or giving land to an ally of Beijing? Well, two things. First of all, we still have the strategic element to this because we still have the military base at Diego Garcia. Now, you can critique that as being part of the agreement and saying we should have given the whole thing over, but just thinking about the criticisms that are coming here from the right, we still have this strategic part of it that we need for geopolitical purposes, even from a pro-Western point of view. And talking about Mauritius as being an ally of Beijing, first of all, that is implying there's some kind of Belt and Road puppet state. No, this country scores the highest in terms of like the democratic accountability of the political system than basically any other country in Africa. Scores incredibly highly on the Human Development Index. The idea that they have no possible agency of their own, and that their allyship of China, because China offered them an economic proposal that they then decided to accept themselves, rather than having colonization imposed upon them and post-colonial agreements foisted upon them, rather than maybe if we wanted them to be our ally rather than China's ally, we should have offered them a better economic proposal rather than having this protracted dispute about whether or not we keep something that has belonged to them forever. The other argument that you get that I find very frustrating about this, I think Tom Harwood made this on Twitter. Well, the Chagos Islands have never been owned by Mauritius whilst it's been the nation state of Mauritius. Whereas this kind of liberal worldview that you get, where unless there's a very specific modern version of a nation state that was in control of a piece of territory, then they shouldn't be able to claim ownership regardless of how these things have been historically or before colonization. Sorry to make this comparison again, but you hear this a lot with Palestine as well. Oh, there's never been a state called Palestine. That's so oblique. Like, come on. We all know that the people who were living in the area that was called Palestine, not an official nation state, but they had their own communities and their own cultures, just like the Chagosians had and the Mauritians had at that time period before it became an independent nation state. So don't play coy with me, liberals. Let's just actually, go along with the ICJ ruling that makes sense in terms of self-determination, rather than just play around with what nation states have been internationally recognized and what you think that means about what self-determination means, rather than the ICJ's official ruling on this.
Yeah, I think the ICJ point is so valid, because I've seen people say, what about the Falklands? And I have to say, I have kind of no strong opinions about the Falklands. I think the people on the island want to remain part of Britain. I don't think anyone did live on the Falklands before Britain got there. Argentina wanted it back because geographically it looks a lot like it should be part of Argentina and not part of Britain. But, it's a complex question. I don't feel like we should definitely decolonize the Falklands. I don't have an opinion, frankly. But when it comes to the Chagos Islands, as far as I know, there isn't sort of a British community there, other than the fact that it's a military base and it's going to remain a military base. I mean, obviously, there are lots of people who say it shouldn't remain a military base, and which the Chagosians should get to go back to all of their islands, including the biggest one, which is the one that I suppose the Americans and the British are keeping. So you can see why the Chagosian voices are not actually that happy about it, even if the Mauritius government is. But yeah, the idea that this sets some kind of strange precedent. I mean, the precedent is colonization is bad and international law is good, right? That's the kind of precedent I want to be setting. Oh, this is a slippery slope. If we let one colony go, we'll have to let them all go. Well, I mean, that is exactly the argument that was made in the 50s and the 60s. And in a sense, it was correct, right? But decolonization was a good thing. I don't know why suddenly everyone on Twitter or everyone on right-wing Twitter is suddenly like, yeah, of course we were opposed to colonization, but I mean, we need some colonies, surely. The BBC had planned to put out a prime-time head-to-head interview between Boris Johnson and Laura Kuenssberg this evening, but they've had to cancel it. The former BBC political editor explained why in a tweet. So she said, while prepping to interview Boris Johnson tomorrow, by mistake, I sent our briefing notes to him in a message meant for my team. Whoops! I've messaged Boris Johnson by accident. That obviously means it's not right for the interview to go ahead. It's very frustrating, and there's no point pretending it's anything other than embarrassing and disappointing, as there are plenty of important questions to be asked. But red faces aside, honesty is the best policy. See you on Sunday. I'm Laura Kuenssberg, someone who's associated in the country's mind with honesty. This is all, of course, pretty embarrassing. I also say a little bit unnecessary. Now, you might ask why. Why would it not be a problem that she sent the questions to Boris Johnson in advance? Well, I'd say for most political interviews, getting one's questions in advance would be a real advantage. You know what you're going to get asked. That makes it significantly easier. I think there's an exception here, though, because when it comes to Laura Kuenssberg and Boris Johnson, well, it's hard to see how any meeting between the two could get any easier. They're already pretty easy. This moment from a 2019 documentary is still my favourite of their many encounters.
I've just been pummeled by pest. He kept corpsing. He kept laughing, which I thought was Robert. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That was an education as always.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
See you later.
Yeah, he kept.
What was he laughing at?
Breaking into gales of laughter. Just seemed to me to be.
Is he laughing at you or with you? I think you have to understand about Boris Johnson is he really wants to be loved, and actually underneath it all, he's quite shy. But we all know someone like that, right? We all know someone who plays the clown.
That's still the stupidest piece of political television I've ever seen in this country. Like the soft lighting, everything about it. And she's speaking in this real sort of like faux psychological tone, you know. We all know someone like that. Someone who wants to play the clown. Really, isn't he a victim who's also kind of charming? Unbelievable. Maybe I'm being unfair, of course. You saw there, Kuenssberg. She didn't ask many questions. That was mainly just editorializing. Maybe while she sort of speaks in soft tones to her own personal camera person, she asks very tough questions when she's actually faced with a very powerful politician. Well, this is what happened next.
Do you want to see it? People look at what you're doing and just think, what are you up to? Is this clearly about your own ambition?
Well, if that was the case, I would have stayed in the cabinet and hung on. But I genuinely don't feel I have a choice.
Given how you were the most prominent face in the Brexit campaign, do you feel responsible for the?
Yeah, you bet. You bet. Put it this way: I certainly think that the role I played in the campaign means that I have a complete duty to try to argue for what I believe in.
Someone said to me, you're like a child who keeps asking for a pony.
I never had a pony.
Someone said to me, you're like a child that keeps asking for a pony. Helena, have you ever, is that a good chat-up line, do you think? Can you imagine a context where you choose that?
Almost certainly not. Although this does show you just how fearless our fourth estate really is. Laura Kuenssberg taking out of her time from doing journalist impressions to schmooze somebody who then who's the most powerful person in the country. I mean, again, it's just really kind of pathetic, isn't it? And she's always been a massive Boris Johnson simp. Let's be real. This is something that she's always been like. I'm assuming Boris Johnson is right at the top of her email address book, that she would just manage to accidentally email him all of the show notes. Oh no, people are speculating that she might have deliberately done it and then got found out by someone at BBC Towers. I don't think that's true. I think it's more the fact that she's just not very good at her job. But what I don't get about all of this story is how she says, well, now we can't do the interview anymore. I'll do it. You want somebody to ask him some questions without emailing him the notes beforehand, all of the questions that he's going to be asked? I'll do it if you want to have somebody who actually will ask some tough questions rather than let him get away with prevaricating on loads of important issues. Or, in fact, do what I've been saying to do ever since Laura Kuenssberg started off her Sunday show on the BBC. Just replace her full-time with Victoria Derbyshire, an actual real journalist who knows how to ask difficult questions to powerful people, because clearly she's the best that BBC has to offer, far more so than Laura Kuenssberg, who's been constantly, quite frankly, unfit to be quite literally at the top of the fourth estate. If you're working as political editor of the BBC, as somebody who is really important in terms of the political coverage in this country, when 70% of the population watch the BBC, you should at least be good at your job. And this is my personal opinion. I think she's rubbish. So maybe replace her with somebody actually good. We might have a better political culture in this country.
I'm still just, I found those clips this morning, obviously, so I have seen them more recently. But just rewatching them, like, who did they think that was for? Like, why did the BBC politics team, right, which is very, significant organisation, a significant team within the BBC, probably the team within the BBC that's under more scrutiny than any other. They sort of think of themselves as public service journalists. Why did they think that the British people wanted to see the most powerful journalist at the organisation interview? I mean, he wasn't the Prime Minister at that point, but it was quite clear he was going to become the Prime Minister, one of the most powerful people in the country, and sort of just talk about him like that. You know, he seems like he's under a lot of stress when it comes to the Brexit negotiations, and still he has a certain aura about him, and I just couldn't help but sniff his hair. Do you think there is an audience for this, Helena? Do you think, like, actually it's me that's misunderstanding the British public?
I'm fully in agreement with you. I really do not think that there is an audience for this in the slightest. I tell you, what's interesting about the ways in which our journalism functions in this country, it's almost only for other journalists, right? You saw how during the election campaign, they banged on over and over and over and over and over again about the private school taxation that Labour were putting forward, when no one in the country cared about this because so few people go to private school, but journalists all send their children to private school. So it became the talk of the town for the election campaign, despite it not cutting through the public whatsoever. I feel like the only other people who would be super interested in the footage that we saw of Laura Kuenssberg there having very intimate moments, politically intimate moments with Boris Johnson, I feel like other journalists would find that interesting. As for members of the public, I can't imagine there's much of a market for it at all. And if there is, there's certainly people who I don't want to share drinks with.
Sometimes when I'm on this show, I get a bit depressed because I'm just not as quick as Ash when it comes to sort of thinking up these wild, humorous scenarios. But thank God we just have ChatGPT. So I've asked it to talk about Boris Johnson in the style of Carrie Bradshaw, and then this is going to be me doing Laura Kuenssberg's job. So there I was, sipping my Cosmopolitan in a cosy corner of a trendy London bar, pondering the complexities of modern romance. It struck me. Boris Johnson is a lot like that charming, yet chaotic guy you meet at a party. Endlessly charismatic, but oh so difficult to pin down. This is exactly like Laura Kuenssberg. Ask ChatGPT to write about Boris Johnson in the style of Carrie Bradshaw, and you literally get our former BBC political editor. Picture it. He stumbles into the room, tousled hair and an affable grin, promising the world, but always leaving you guessing. This is exactly it. One moment he's declaring grand visions for the future, and the next he's lost in a whirlwind of scandals and gaffes, much like a fabulous but unreliable love interest. Man, I could save the BBC 300 grand a year by replacing Laura Kuenssberg with the Carrie Bradshaw ChatGPT combo. Fabulous. I'm glad your contribution was long enough that ChatGPT had the time to sort of spit that out. So thank you for that, Helena.
It's not a problem. It's not a problem. That seemed like scarily accurate. And as you say, like £320,000, that's almost 2 Sue Greys that we could save the BBC by replacing Laura Kuenssberg with ChatGPT.
In the end, we're left with a classic Carrie moment, navigating the tangled web of ambition, charm, and the occasional faux pas. Because in politics, just like in love, sometimes it's the messy bits that make it all so irresistibly fascinating. And with that, let's wrap up tonight's Novara Live. Helena, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
It was definitely a pleasure to join you in the CW Live studio as Union too. So,
someone in the comments said that it looks like I'm hosting from Labour's latest billionaire donors penthouse in Soho, but no, we're quite far from there, I have to say. Before we go, we've got an event coming up. The question, is it already too late to avoid catastrophic climate breakdown? That's one of the questions Ash Sarkar will be asking Professor and best-selling author Andreas Malm for a special IRL episode of Novara Downstream. You can join us on Tuesday the 5th of November from 7 p.m. at Peckham Levels in London. Ash and Andreas will be discussing his new book with an audience Q&A and social to follow. Tickets start from £15. Go to peckhamlevels.org/events/Novara Media. My understanding is these normally sell out very quickly. So if you do want to see Ash and Andreas Malm in real, in person, do make sure you go and don't waste a moment buying those tickets. For now, from the CWU studios, I've been Michael Walker. You've been watching Novara Live. I'll be back tomorrow from 6 p.m. Good night.